has something that's called in the services the combat operational stress. And then on the far right, it has post-traumatic stress, and most right, the post-traumatic stress disorder. As you go through that spectrum, it's very helpful to understand it as a means of the first step in treating it. Now, a book that is available, Combat Trauma Healing Manual, and I show this because this is authored by one of our presenters today, Chris Edsett. Chris Edsett and his wife Renella are both going to be presenting, 30-year members of Campus Crusade for Christ. They have just put a new book on the street called When War Comes Home. So in addition to writing books and helping, they're also counselors, and they've been working with the Military Ministry Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Task Force over the last 2 years. So Chris and Renella, very qualified, very crafted, both reverends, and they're the parents of 4 children. So Chris and Renella Edsett will do a wonderful job illuminating this combat trauma spectrum for us, which is an important first step in understanding how to treat combat trauma among active duty and veterans across our land. Thank you. Now I give you Chris and Renella Edsett.
Today, my husband Chris and I want to give you the big picture, kind of a whirlwind tour of what combat trauma is and how it impacts individuals' lives. The word trauma actually comes from the Greek word wound. A traumatic event can cause such a severe wound that it can become life-threatening or overwhelming to almost anyone. Another way to describe it is when a person is impacted by a traumatic event, it etches the thumbprint of that trauma on the person's body, soul, and spirit. These thumbprints can affect a person's will to live, their beliefs about God, themselves, and their world, their dignity, and their sense of security. For our troops and families, the thumbprint of trauma has touched their lives as well. According to a recent report from the VA's National Center for Ptsd, 40% of OEF or OIF veterans have or may acquire PTSD. For those who don't know it, OEF is Operation Enduring Freedom. These are our troops that are fighting terrorism in Afghanistan. OIF, or Operation Iraqi Freedom, is our troops fighting terrorism in Iraq. In addition, the VA's National Center reports that 80% of OEF or OIF troops acknowledge that they have serious mental health issues. 40% stated that they weren't interested in getting help, but only 26% actually took steps to receive help, and 38% of those who sought help were diagnosed with PTSD or combat trauma. This combat trauma or PTSD has been called many names throughout the centuries, which makes it clear that this disorder is not unique to modern wars, but is common to all wars. During the latter half of the 1600s, the Swiss observed a consistent set of symptoms in some of their soldiers, and they called it nostalgia. German doctors of the same period used the term Heimweh, and the French called it maladie du pays, but both terms roughly translated homesickness. The Spanish called it estar roto, which means to be broken. During the American Civil Wars, it was called the soldier's heart. World War I, they called it shell shock. World War II, they called it battle fatigue. In Korean War, they called it war neurosis. And in the 1970s, they coined the term Vietnam Veterans Syndrome. It wasn't until 1980 that the American Psychiatric Association formally identified, named, and defined the results of an extreme traumatic experience as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. As we have traveled around the country, scores of veterans from World War II on have shared their stories with us, and many still carry unresolved pain. Richard Gabriel is quoted by David Grossman from his book on killing, the psychological cost of learning to kill in war and society, in which Gabriel says, "In every war in which American soldiers have fought in this country, the chance of becoming a psychiatric casualty, of being debilitated for some period of time as consequence of the stress of military life, were greater than the chances of being killed by enemy fire. So what is combat trauma? As our troops return from combat or other intense operational deployments, it's probably safe to say that they've all experienced stress. As you know, there's positive stress and there's negative stress. Positive stress is what kept them focused, energized, and probably saved their lives and others. Negative stress could have and can put themselves and others in danger. But any kind of stress, good or bad, can affect their spirits, their souls, and their bodies. Most stress reactions, although unpleasant in the short time, do not result in long-term problems. In some cases, however, the stress of operation deployment can cause more serious problems that require additional help to overcome. Chris will now be giving you a further description of what combat trauma is and give a brief overview of the combat trauma spectrum that covers the 5 kinds of deployment-related stress problems that you should know about.
There are many things in life that are not black and white, not either or, not you have it or you don't. And the symptoms and diagnoses that are related to combat certainly cannot be classified in this way either. You can't say this person has combat trauma and this person does not have combat trauma so easily. There's a broad spectrum of responses that a person would have to the traumas that are associated with war. And these fall along a wide continuum based on a number of factors that we're going to go into later in this series. The term combat trauma is a general term that we use to describe the responses that a troop will have to the various stressors of war. It describes the same spectrum of conditions that the U.S. Army Center for Health Promotion and Preventive Medicine calls deployment-related stress. We've chosen to use the term combat trauma simply because we feel it communicates the concept a little more succinctly, and it links easily with the terms and the concepts that the general public has already heard and recognizes. Now, as you see on the graphic on your screen or in your notes right now, there is a broad spectrum that involves a variety of conditions on this combat trauma spectrum. And they progress in severity from the left end of the spectrum, or the mild end, all the way up through the very severe end. The mild end of the spectrum, these include relatively easy to mitigate conditions such as pre-deployment stress and deployment stresses, and the stresses that accompany reintegration of the troop back into his or her family or community or culture that they left from earlier. We're going to be going into a lot more detail regarding these conditions in just a moment. But the next stop on that spectrum, as you progress from left to right, identifies combat operational stress reactions, which describe normal reactions to the abnormal events of combat. Now, these symptoms tend to occur immediately after the stressor and are generally resolved fairly quickly without significant treatment. Next, we see adjustment disorders. Now, these are symptoms or behaviors that show distress in excess of what we would expect to see based on the stressors that we observe. To meet the definition of this diagnosis, the symptoms must present within 3 months of the original onset of the stressor and be able to be resolved within 6 months. Next, we see acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. These are at the severe end of the combat trauma spectrum. As you can imagine, these are very serious conditions, and in the vast majority of cases, they require proactive, informed therapy in order for them to be resolved. Now, if a troop doesn't receive this kind of therapy, it's very likely that the symptoms will persist for months or years or even for a lifetime. What about those who come back from combat and they never were actually involved in direct trigger pulling or conflicts while they were in the theater? They never fired a shot, and yet they still return home with very distressing symptoms, exactly similar to those who were involved in direct combat. Well, these troops can also experience combat trauma, long periods of sleep-deprived duty, monotony, stressful assignments, and with the full knowledge that because of the kinds of conflicts that exist right now over in the Middle East, where there is no clear fighting line, there's no safe place, It's very difficult to identify the enemy, and there's no telling when a mortar or an IED or a sniper might particularly strike. That kind of stress, 24/7, eventually is going to take a severe toll on any troop that's over there. So when a troop knows that at any moment, even when they're in the green zone of Baghdad, which is supposedly safe, at any moment there could be a mortar attack, there could be any kind of a thing that could happen, and they know it could be their last moment, this eventually is going to have an effect that could cause them to experience even full-blown PTSD.
What I'm going to be talking about in this third section is how our troops and families are impacted by combat trauma. The first three components of the spectrum includes the pre-deployment, deployment, and reintegration issues. The second is combat or operational stress reactions, and the last is adjustment disorders. The mildest stressor on the spectrum includes pre-deployment, deployment, and reintegration. One of the issues our troops and their families face is the stress of pre-deployment. This starts when a troop is notified that they are going to be deployed. When that happens, there's usually immediate anxiety regarding their impending deployment. They and their families often experience a wide range of emotions. Other stressors they may face include financial issues they have to deal with, emotional and logistical stresses while preparing the family for the troop's absence. There is also an increase in training tempo and preparation for the mission. For couples and children, there can be emotional outbursts as they try to cope with the looming reality of long-term separation. Another issue our troops and families face is their deployment. Deployment stress includes being on life or death alert almost all the time. There is no enemy lines in Iraq and Afghanistan. They may experience traumatic, horrific events. Some may get physically wounded or face near-death experiences, or even see their comrades get wounded and die. Forever on their hearts and minds is the concern they have for their family's welfare while downrange. There is anxiety over children's development, missing out on important family occasions, births, deaths. Many have fears regarding their spouse's loyalty and fidelity while separated. There can be poor communication infrastructures resulting in feelings of helplessness regarding family emergencies. Many face loneliness, boredom, fatigue, sleep deprivation, discomfort, fear, sadness, and exhaustion. And remember, we're not just dealing with one deployment. Many are facing multiple deployments, which last 6 to 15 months. The last component of the first section of the CD spectrum that our troops and their families are facing is the reintegration issues. As our troops return home to their families, there's usually a honeymoon period, but after time, there may raise rising tension in their lives. They often will encounter various difficulties during the transition from deployment back home and to family life. Pursuits and concerns that can bring about this tension can include a myriad of issues, like changing the troops' main emotional link and support from their military buddies back to their spouse or family, resuming and sharing household or family roles, getting used to communicating with their spouses on an intimate, frequent basis again, adjusting to different levels of order and control in the home when they are used to being deployed, adjusting to different family dynamics due to the aging of the children, coordinating with his or her spouse regarding child rearing and child discipline issues, synchronizing his or her emotional or sexual needs and expectations with their spouse, getting used to altered psychological and social skills in response to combat trauma, deciding how major and day-to-day decisions are to be made in the home, dealing with multitudinous of briefings, debriefings, training sessions, and surveys, enjoying welcome home ceremonies without them becoming burdensome or triggering events. Our troops and their families face many issues, and these are listed in the student notes. The next section on the CT spectrum includes the combat operational stress reactions. This is a normal reaction for anyone who goes into battle or other dangerous operations. This is not a mental illness, and people who experience this are not sick or weak. It's just the body's way of protesting to say, hey, slow down, because they push themselves past their regular limits of endurance. The symptoms of COSR, or combat operational stress reactions, can look a lot like symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, acute stress disorder, or adjustment disorders, but they tend to occur immediately after a stressful event, and they get better quickly without significant treatment. The COSR symptoms can include things like tension, aches and pains, jumpiness, trembling, cold sweats, expecting the worst, irritableness, poor attention, poor mental focus. They can't remember details. They get out of breath. Their fingers and toes can tingle. They can have an upset stomach. They can vomit. They can have diarrhea. They can have constipation. They have that 1,000-yard stare. They can have bad dreams. They can get mad at their leaders. They can have trouble communicating. They can lose faith in their unit and their leaders in the unit. They have trouble sleeping, and they can start blaming themselves. These symptoms and others are listed also in your student notes. The last one I'd like to talk about is about adjustment disorders. Adjustment disorders are much more common than either PTSD or acute stress disorder, and on the whole are usually much less serious. An adjustment disorder occurs when an individual is exposed to an identifiable stressor or stressors, causing a reaction which results in significant excessive distress or significant impairment. The reaction can involve 3 symptoms. The first one is depression, where they can experience tearfulness and feelings of hopelessness. The second one is anxiety, where they can experience nervousness, worry, or jitterness. Or there's the third one, which is disturbance of conduct, where they can violate the rights of others, such as reckless driving or fighting. Or it can be any combination of these 3. When someone has been diagnosed with a disorder, I like to tell those that I counsel that this is the place when a person gets stuck. Sometimes they get stuck for a short period of time. In other times, they will get stuck for a long period of time. For someone who's been diagnosed with adjustment disorders, they're usually not stuck for a long period of time. Symptoms can occur as late as 3 months following an event, but usually are resolved within 6 months. Chris is going to be sharing next on the stressors and behavioral and emotional responses of troops and families to the final 2 components of the spectrum.
Acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder are very similar in terms of their symptomology. Both are extreme, long-term reactions to an abnormal stressor, except the main difference between the two is that with acute stress disorder, there's an increased incidence of dissociative episodes and a shortened onset and duration of symptoms. Now, what actually happens physiologically when someone experiences ASD or PTSD? One of God's top design priorities when He created us was that we would be equipped to defend ourselves in a wide variety of dangerous situations. And with this in mind, He equipped us with an amazing set of response mechanisms that help us in our brains. Our brains, as you probably know, are divided into 2 halves. On the left side, that's our analytical side. It scrutinizes incoming information logically. It thinks rationally in very concrete terms. It's on this side that we store our practical information, things like how to read, how to speak, how to spell, how to do math. And this side remembers names and craves precision. Now, if our left side is more like a computer, our right side is more like a photo album. This side remembers faces and craves rapport and relationship and fellowship. This is our emotional side. It is very intuitive, very spontaneous, experience-oriented, it's artistic, creative. It stores emotion. We dream on the right side of our brain. And very importantly, this is the alarm side of our brain. Now, beneath these 2 halves of the brain is our lower brain, or brain stem. Now, this part of our brain controls all the automatic responses and functions in our body, such as breathing and digestion and heart rate. the lower brain always trumps the two halves of the upper brain. For instance, doesn't matter how logical it may seem to you or how passionately you may want to, you cannot stop your heart from beating just by thinking about it. Plus, if you want to stop yourself from breathing, you can hold your breath for a while, but before long, that brainstem is going to assert its dominance and force you to take that breath, even if you're underwater at the time. When we encounter something that we would consider is a life-threatening situation, a cascade of hormone-based reactions is triggered. Our hearts beat faster, our lungs pump faster, thousands of small muscles in our arms and legs constrict, which pushes blood deep into our muscles so that we can have quick movement and strength. Our energy levels spike. We gain all kinds of amazing stamina and muscle power so that we are ready to fight or fly like we never have before. The ultimate objective in this set of reactions is survival, and it was put there by God. But you see, something also happens deep inside our brains as well. Our right brain alarm goes off and drowns out all the logical analysis of the left brain. And basically, it starts shouting less thinking and more action. It also starts taking pictures like mad. Very strong and clear memories are being recorded, probably so that we will remember this event and avoid it in the future. At this point, our lower brain takes over. It is live or die time. With this organ in control, nothing else matters. It automatically directs the rest of the body into a series of very complex and focused ways to make sure that we will do whatever it takes in order to flee the danger and to survive. Okay, a person might say, the crisis is over, I survived, but why can't I move on? Why do I keep reliving the trauma that I experienced? Often, a trauma survivor can go through a short period of decompression and processing and return pretty close to normal. But if the traumatizing event was exceptionally violent or life-threatening, or if there were multiple episodes, the brain stays stuck in this crisis alert mode. It's kind of like what this one Vietnam veteran said when he was asked, when did you leave Vietnam? And his response is, last night. It'll be that way every night until my soul leaves this old body. Think of it in terms of walking across a frozen lake. Many of you may have done that, or you can imagine what it's like. At first, it's a lot of fun sliding around and acting like some kind of a ice dancer, doing pirouettes and all. Then all of a sudden, you hear this cracking and popping all around you. You know the ice is getting ready to give way. What happens? Well, immediately you spread your arms and legs to give yourself balance and support. Your eyes become as big as softballs. You hold your breath. Your heart starts beating like mad because you're just getting ready to go into that icy water. And so as you stand there frozen for a couple of seconds and you realize that, hey, I'm not going down, you start very slowly and very carefully backing away the way you came from. Well, after a while, you find that you're back on relatively solid ice. Well, then what would you do? Is it likely that you would start jumping around and skipping again like you were before? Probably not, because now you realize that the ice underneath you could give way at any moment. And so you continue to walk very carefully until you get to the shore of the lake and where safety is. See, after a traumatic event, our brain knows that it just had an incredibly close call, and it is determined to be ready to react if it confronts that danger again. Now, that's a really good idea, except if it gets stuck in that mode, which is essentially what ASD and PTSD are all about. It's like that ice walker tippy-toeing the 2 miles of concrete cement sidewalk all the way back home because he's stuck in that crisis alert mode. It is illogical, but ASD and PTSD are not logical. They're emotional, so it doesn't have to make sense. That's just the way your body is going to react. Now, the shock physically alters parts of your brain. Your reactive pathways modify, your brain chemistry changes, and it becomes hypersensitive, overreacting to a lot of the normal stimuli. Your hippocampus, that's the part of your brain that interprets and calms your emotional responses, it actually shrinks and works less effectively. Your left brain and your right brain hemispheres have trouble communicating and balancing each other. So you're either all emotions and unordered, or you're emotionless and cold and withdrawn and not a whole lot of fun to be around. Sometimes both extremes within 5 minutes. And whenever your brain senses that it's getting near to the scene of the crime that it had encountered before, via some kind of a sensory trigger like a sight, or a sound, or a smell, or a memory, it quickly opens up that photo album that it created during the earlier traumatic event and puts on this intense slide and video show to re-instruct you that you do not want to go back there again. You know, it kind of says, what are you, nuts? You know, don't you remember the last time we went there? We almost died, you know, get away, run as fast as you can. Well, in both cases, with acute stress disorder and with post-traumatic stress disorder, there are three main categories of symptoms that have been identified. Now, no one is going to have all these symptoms, but in order to meet the actual definition of ASD or PTSD, they need to have at least one or a few from each of these three categories I'll be sharing with you next. The first category is called re-experiencing symptoms. You see, memories and images of the traumatic event will intrude unbidden into the sufferer's mind, and they will experience them as if they are actually happening. They're not just a memory, they're actually feeling like I'm back there and it's happening again. They're often accompanied by very intense emotions such as anger and grief and fear and guilt. You can see in your notes there that they include many symptoms like nightmares, sleepwalking, sleep fighting, daydreams, flashbacks, somatic flashbacks, which have to do with physical pain or medical conditions which will suddenly emerge linked to the feelings or the bodily experiences that they had during the traumatic event. They may fixate on war experiences, they live in the past. They may have spontaneous psychotic episodes where all of a sudden the present world seems to vanish and they are back in that traumatic situation, experiencing the traumatic event as well. Again, it's also called dissociation. Panic attacks or phobias are also involved in these re-experiencing symptoms. The second major category of symptoms are called avoidance symptoms. You see, a traumatized individual will attempt to avoid situations, people, or events that remind them of their trauma. Consequently, they feel numb, emotionless, withdraw into themselves. They try to shut out any of the painful memories that they experienced earlier. Friends and family feel rejected by them because they're simply unable to show appropriate affection or emotion. Some of the symptoms involved in the avoidance category are avoiding anyone or anything that reminds them of the traumatic event, physical or emotional reactions that remind them of the traumatic event. They become self-isolating. They become very anxious in crowds or in traffic. They experience a lot of despair and depression. They have an inability to trust other people very closely, very reluctant to talk about their traumatic experiences. They lack interest or motivation in things like employment and things that they used to enjoy, like, for instance, recreation or former hobbies or sex or exercise. Relationships that were once very close, even intimate, become very strained and cold and distant. They require just too much energy in order to maintain them. They experience emotional numbness. They can't get happy or sad. Substance abuse in order to get numb, abusing things like drug and alcohol or food. Suicidal thoughts, suicidal attempts, physical fatigue, neglecting or abandoning personal care, hygiene, nutrition, exercise. These are all avoidance symptoms that we see in those experiencing ASD or PTSD. The third major category of symptoms is called the arousal symptoms. You see, fearing further traumatization, a lot of PTSD and ASD sufferers are always on the alert, on guard, jumpy, unable to sleep, very angry, irritable, keyed up. Many also have concentration and memory problems that fit into the same category. Now, some of those arousal symptoms are things like anger, irritability, having a real short fuse, throwing fits of rage, hypervigilance, always on the alert, always need to be armed with a knife or a gun nearby. Very easily startled, reacting to loud noises. They get involved in substance abuse in order to get unnumbed. Very opposite of what the avoidance symptoms would produce. They have reduced cognitive abilities. They're slower in their thinking. They're more confused, poor problem-solving abilities, trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, very prominent among ASD and PTSD sufferers. They experience night sweats. They have an accelerated heart rate, rapid breathing. Many times, particularly Christian soldiers and troops who go over will question or abandon their faith, feeling like God has betrayed them or abandoned them. They were very mad at God because things didn't work out the way they were taught they should work out back when they were in Sunday school. They often have a fear of becoming violent, and very often they actually do become violent and provoke fights. They have homicidal thoughts from time to time. Many times they'll have an anniversary reaction, where when the month or year anniversary of the traumatic event rolls around, they often become very anxious. They become adrenaline junkies sometimes, being involved in high-risk behavior just to get that adrenaline pumping. Sometimes they're involved in self-mutilation, cutting, or excessive tattooing just to be able to feel something and keep themselves feeling something that's very high level extreme.
When we flew out to the Comfort, the hospital ship, I had to make several mental notes. I had to decide where each patient was going to go based on how critical they were. The ones that weren't that critical were on the other side where my crew chief was, and he would keep an eye on them as best he could and let me know what was going on. The space that I had to move was about the size of this chair. So I had the ability to either be on my knees or squat if I could maneuver myself, because not only were we carrying the patients, we were also carrying some of their gear and records and different things. So I didn't have a lot of room. So choosing where they were going to go in the aircraft, who was going to be the first one out, that was usually the one that was on a portable ventilator, battery operated ventilator that was breathing for them. The next thing I had to do is make a mental note of, since we were going out to a ship, we were flying over water, and in the eventual case of landing in water, I had to decide who I was going to get out if I could. And it was that mental checklist that I had to make. If the situation arises and I have to, then I choose this person. And it's not the person that's on a ventilator, because they're already, I have the whole justification in my head. And then those were the two main things that I had to mentally do. And then physically, I had to monitor each patient depending on what their level of injury was. And I would say 95 and 98% of the time, the one on the portable ventilator, the ventilator would stop working for whatever reason. The battery would run out, or it just would stop working. And so I would have to do the quick maneuver of detaching the ventilator from the patient. They had a tube down their throat, so I had to hook up a bag to the tube and move the oxygen and do all of this stuff just so I could breathe for them. And that's what I would do on my knees on a hard aircraft, is just breathe. Every 3 to 5 seconds, I would squeeze a bag for this person, knowing that if someone else on that aircraft were to start going down, I would also then have to choose, okay, which one am I going to attend to? Because this person that I'm breathing for can't breathe on their own. Do I stop and help this other person, or do I have to let this other person go?
Do you ever find yourself back on that helicopter?
Almost nightly. Even still, the nightmares are the scenario I just presented. And I'm breathing for someone, and then one patient, then another one starts crashing, as we call it. Their vital signs start diminishing, and I can't get to them. Or I can't get to the helicopter where I know where the patients are and my medical gear. And that's my biggest nightmare, is not being able to get to my patients. Or if I do, then I'm paralyzed somehow and I can't help. That's one of my biggest fears, is not being able to get there.
So every night you're providing urgent care, really, in your dreams? Just
about.
Well, let me fast forward. You've been on a lengthy deployment, and I understand the dynamic that goes with coming home. There's a certain euphoria associated with that, but it's also short-lived. So tell us about the height and the depth of coming home.
We finally did make it home. And because we were National Guard, there was media there when we arrived. There was some pomp and circumstance, but we just wanted to get home. We wanted to sleep in our own bed. We wanted to see our families. For me, it was my dog. I hadn't seen her in a year, so you said the euphoria lasted about a day for me. And then the reality of being back to normal started to settle, or to set in, and realizing that nothing's normal anymore. I didn't sleep that first night. Well, actually, I ended up not sleeping for a year, but that's a whole other story. I got up the next morning, had to drive an hour north to get my gear because that's where the plane had dropped it off. And then while I was gone, there was one thing that kind of sustained me, that I looked forward to, that place that I could go to in my mind, that safe place, that familiar place. And it was my favorite coffee shop. My Saturday routine: go to Full City Coffee, get my drink, my bagel, my newspaper, my journal, and sit there for 2 hours. And that was me time. And that was the one thing that I wanted to do when I got back. I wanted to go to Full City, sit down, read the paper, drink my coffee. So that first day I got home after running some errands, I went to Full City and I got my drink and my bagel, and I sat down and I started to feel really, really uncomfortable. I'm sitting next to plate glass windows. We're 3 blocks from the hospital, so ambulances and fire trucks are screaming by. There's loud noises. People are dropping chairs. I had to leave. The one place that I thought that I could go back to that was safe and familiar wasn't anymore. And as I went throughout the day and months after, I started to realize that nothing was the same. Those places that I would go to in my head just to go back home, in a sense, they weren't there anymore. The way that I saw life was very different. And then the town that I live in is very, very liberal. And so when we returned, there were still a lot of those protests going on, and just the anger inside of me. These people that had no idea what they were talking about, and listening to people complaining in line that that they had to stand in line was very annoying, and I couldn't understand what was going on. Why was I reacting and responding to these people? Why can't I just ignore them? Kind of like what I did when I can just shut off my emotions, but I couldn't. The anger was starting to build, and I wanted to punch them, to be honest.
Tell me about some of those triggers. For instance, you mentioned the firehouse and the sirens. What do you think of when you hear a siren?
Well, for us, when we were deployed, the siren, which actually sounds much like an air raid siren that you would hear in London when the bombers were coming in, Germans were coming in, that meant a missile or some sort of foreign object was heading our way. And
Scud alert.
Scud alert, yes. So that meant we had to get in our masks, because we get into our gas masks and our protective suits, and as you know, with all your training, you have to put that mask on in 9 seconds, which means you first hold your breath and close your eyes and grab for your mask and you put it on, clear it, seal it, and then you put on the rest of your gear. So that alarm became so automatic. 9 times the first day that alarm went off, the first day of the war. One of them was actually a chemical alarm, which you get your pucker factor going up. Think about all those chemicals that could be coming our way and the effects that. But it was a conditioned response. Those alarms go off, hold your breath, close your eyes, grab for your mask. And when I got back home, and there was sirens or alarms similar to that crescendoing siren and coming down. It was an automatic Pavlov type response.
You quit breathing, first of all.
Stop breathing, hold my breath. And I mean, instantly, even though I was in, this actually happened when I went back to work, where it was on the television behind me. The History Channel was on, and it was a World War II bombing series, and this air raid siren went off, and I jumped up and kicked over the chair and held my breath, and my eyes were closed, and I went for my mask, and it wasn't there, but I'm also moving forward, and I run into a chair, another chair, and that's what kind of brought me to. And I was humiliated, and I was just in shock that, okay, I know I'm in Sacred Heart Hospital, but I just went for my mask that isn't there. And then I started feeling unsafe. I don't have my mask. I don't have my weapon. I don't have the things that I need, that I know are going to protect me. So that's one of my major triggers.
And how are we doing today with that particular trigger? I mean, even today, you hear a siren.
Oddly enough, this happened last night when I was outside, and it was a faint crescendoing siren, and I jumped up from where I was. And whereas I don't go through the whole process now, I have to verbally, I have to physically tell myself to breathe. I have to say it out loud, because that will give me to breathe. I'm talking and breathing. But the initial jump up response is still there. And it's a little embarrassing when I'm around people that don't understand what that's all about, and they're looking at me. That happened when I was at work. They looking at me like I was crazy, and then they didn't know what to do, so they just started talking to themselves, or they left. I'm standing there in the middle of the room, almost hyperventilating because of what was just going on, and nobody knew what to do.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, the main differences between acute stress disorder and PTSD has to do with time. The rule of thumb is that if the symptoms begin within 4 weeks of the traumatic event, the condition is called acute stress disorder during the first month of them experiencing those symptoms. Acute stress disorder will resolve itself within those first 4 weeks. But if the symptoms persist longer than a month, then the diagnosis is changed to PTSD, as long as it still meets that full criteria of the definition of PTSD. For the next 3 months after that initial month, when it's ASD, for the next 3 months, it's called acute PTSD. If the symptoms persist longer than those 3 months, it's called chronic PTSD. You see all that on the graphic, either on your notes or on the screen. Now, with PTSD, a person could actually function pretty close to normal for many months or even years after the traumatic event before they begin to experience symptoms. If the symptoms start longer than 6 months after the initial stressor, then it's called delayed onset PTSD. This is something that a number of World War II veterans are experiencing even today. Back when World War II was over, they experienced a lot of high emotion and anxiety. They stuffed it on down because they didn't know what else to do about it and never dealt with it. And so they raised families, had careers, retired. Now that they're in their 80s, they're seeing things on the TV relating to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. A lot of these PTSD symptoms are beginning to surface in these men some 50 and 60 years after the conflict. That's definitely delayed onset PTSD. As you might imagine, experiencing combat is not the only way that a person can encounter PTSD. One can end up having PTSD through natural disasters because of things like floods, and hurricanes, and tornadoes, earthquakes, and tsunamis. Just accidents like traffic accidents or household accidents, assault, sexual assault, kidnapping, torture, viewing any of the above. And this is a big problem with a lot of firefighters and policemen and policewomen that are involved in their normal duties, or receiving tragic news about yourself or about a close loved one Perhaps it might be a prognosis of a terminal illness or something like that. Now, not everyone who is exposed to a traumatic event, the ones that I just mentioned, necessarily will get PTSD. Numerous authorities estimate that anywhere between 75% and 90% of Americans have experienced or witnessed some kind of an event that could produce PTSD, but only about 5 to 10% of non-combat general public individuals will actually develop PTSD. There are several factors that make it less likely that a person will be affected and experience either ASD or PTSD. These are factors such as fewer, less intense events, the person's mental or emotional interpretation of the event, in other words, giving meaning to the traumatic event that happened to them. For instance, if they were involved in, let's say, a tornado, and they can just say, oh, this is just a natural occurrence. It's not like the universe is out to get me. I can understand that these sorts of things simply happen. Or a troop over there might have the attitude of saying that, you know, I am glad to have been able to suffer for my country. I count it a privilege, and this is something that I will absorb for that greater purpose. The person's foundational mental and emotional state has a lot to do with it as well. For instance, faith will come in very strongly here. Belief in one's mission is also a very positive mitigator, which was a problem for a lot of our Vietnam veterans because they weren't supported by the country. And then when they came home and they were insulted and spat upon, and they felt like they were criminals coming home, this greatly exacerbated their symptoms and caused many of them to end up with PTSD. Another mitigating factor on the positive side is the ability to envision a good possibility or the greater good, kind of Romans 8:28. You know that all things work together for good, them who are the called, them who love God. And then also positive unit leadership is also a very positive thing that helps mitigate that. If they've got a good platoon leader or officers above them that help them keep things in context and know that they're being taken care of, that makes a big difference. Teamwork and buddy support during and after the traumatic event makes a big difference as well. We see a big contrast between today's troops and World War II troops in this respect, because back in those days, after the war was over, let's say in Europe, it took them several weeks to make their way back to the coast, and then they get on a troop ship, and they were 6 weeks going across the ocean, during which time they had lots of time to debrief with their fellow soldiers to talk about the experiences they had. And this was very therapeutic for all of them. And then finally, debriefing within 72 hours. Those who are very involved with critical incident stress management have determined that if a person is able to talk about the experience they had within that magical 72 hours, it seems to greatly diminish the likelihood that they will develop PTSD. There are some other factors that make it more likely that a person will be affected. More recent, intense events, which is happening over in Iraq and Afghanistan all the time, a greater level of personal involvement in the traumatizing event. In other words, experiencing it rather than simply witnessing it. When the event occurs on top of other current stressors, like for instance, a person may be afraid of what's happening with their relationship to their fiance, and they're also having a lot of anxiety about the combat they're in. And all of a sudden they receive a Dear John letter from their fiance. This makes things a lot worse. Traumatic events in childhood. Somebody is involved in, as a child with parental abuse or sexual abuse, then what happens is their abuse cup is kind of closer to full when they get off into combat. And it doesn't take much more to send that cup over the edge and help them to develop actual post-traumatic stress disorder. Then finally, strong feelings of responsibility over what happened, what they witnessed, or what they experienced in the traumatic situation. I want to shift our attention next to
Can you see me and hear me? Okay. I wanted to kind of pause there. Sorry. Goodness, all of a sudden I'm sneezing. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things that have been uncovered here. We've talked a lot about trauma in the past. And as you can tell from the video, when we're dealing with combat, deployment, pre-deployment, and all of that, there are some factors that are different than the trauma that we talked about before. What kind of things stood out to you as we were talking through this?
I think one big difference is they know they were going to it. They were going to experience this, rather than having it accidentally or unexpectedly happen.
So do you think that helps him prepare more?
It does a little bit, but of course it's different actually experiencing it.
Yeah.
I was able, I could relate to what the woman was saying, you know, like being prepared just in case there's somebody dropped some bacteria, and automatically your first reaction is to get a mask, right? So I can understand that. It's hard for me to fathom having that kind of a training and having to turn off and on that training automatically.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because you don't turn the training off. The brain, the body, the tendons, the ligaments, the blood vessels develop a system. So, like she's talking about that falling artillery round, that you hear that and your body reacts a certain way, okay? That's either incoming artillery, right? Or a bomb has been dropped. So you've got something that's going to fall and it's going to explode, okay? Your brain and your body know that because that's what you've been trained to prepare for, right? There's a pop and a whistle that's a steady whistle. It doesn't de-escalate, that lets you know that it's some kind of a gas attack, right? So you're trained and conditioned to do this, and for the rest of your life, people want to call it muscle memory. It's body memory. It's not just muscle memory. That's really minimizing what's going on. That never goes away. It may diminish, and the intensity may diminish, but that never goes away. And then if you add a trauma event on top of that, it's really cemented in. Because this is about your raw survival. This isn't just a potential threat. This is a very real threat that will take your life. So the emotional intensity of that cements that system even more.
So it makes you wonder whether, you know, it really is worth going to war in some sense, you know. I know it's necessary to protect. It's necessary to have a military to protect the country, but the cost and the mental cost.
Well, that's why we talk about the consequences of war. There's consequences to war. The question becomes, you know, is the exchange of what that cost is, what those consequences are, worth worth it? And there's a lot of debate about that.
Does this happen with other countries, like in the other side, like in the Middle East?
Sure, to some extent, because we're all human beings. We're all human beings. So yeah, there may be cultural things where you can get into it, but it still impacts your mind, your heart, your soul. You can't help it. You're a human being.
So it's just like, practically, it's just like any kind of training that you have, right? Like if you're a dancer, then automatically your body dances when you hear music, right? It's just a type of training.
Right, and this training is to survive violence and to be violent. systematically violent and to survive violence. So what other thoughts do you have on some of the differences that were discussed?
One of the things that she was saying, the gal that the soldier they were interviewing, that really stood out to me was she had not only a hypervigilance to protect, and that kept coming up in her dreams, but also then that hypervigilance of, okay, what's coming next? And I can only imagine, and we get to experience some of that and, working with trauma survivors, but to that magnitude, right? The encompassing that is happening in the whole entire body system in that for long periods of time. And her sharing that, it was years and she wanted to go home and see her dog. I just like, oh my goodness. And then her whole experience in the coffee shop, that was pretty incredible, especially her being ticked off and people being grumpy in the coffee line. So when Autumn went to Thailand a few years ago now, right, she came home and she was so angry because she got to see things that she had never seen. So I can imagine not only seeing things like that you can erase from your mind, right, really gives you a different sense of purpose and value of life, but does give you that anger and, you know what? Quit complaining about your coffee. Be appreciative that you have your coffee. You have no idea how hard, people have to work.
You're angry at waiting in line for your latte.
Right.
Well, there were people that were waiting in line hoping to be able to get blood or a wound healed or a wound patched up or, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was huge.
Yeah.
And then her saying the language that she used, she said, and again, we know this from dealing with grief, but nothing is normal anymore. So really understanding that, okay, I have a completely different paradigm on life that will never go back to my sweet thought of Saturday morning paper and coffee. Yeah. And that's just huge,
It really is huge. And we have to remember that when we're dealing with loss, especially trauma, people say, well, how long is it going to take them to get back to normal? They never will. Normal no longer exists. There's going to be a new normal. But getting back to normal, that's an imaginary place. That's like the land of Oz. It doesn't really exist. And so that kind of idea, that kind of talk has to go away. You establish a new normal. Because you are forever changed. Trauma forever changes you, and combat trauma changes you in very significant ways. Because one of the things that goes with this, we talk about this in Consequences of War a lot, is the moral dilemma faced by those who have been in combat and have been needed to do violence that maimed or killed someone else. The moral dilemma of the guy next to you taking a sniper round in the throat, but the sniper didn't shoot you and you survived. That's a moral dilemma. Why him and not me? So there are moral dilemmas that combat personnel have to deal with as well, and that is ongoing trauma as on top of that. I know guys whose units were completely wiped out in Vietnam. We're talking 50 years ago, who still struggle with a moral dilemma, survivor's guilt, if you will. 50 years. I mean, these guys are in their late 60s, early 70s, right? They've struggled with this for more than twice at the age they were when they deployed. So when we talk about combat and combat trauma and the consequences of war, we're going to take a break here in a minute. When we come back, we'll talk about the effect on the family and especially on women, there are significant differences. And like he pointed out in this last part, when you have people who have experienced significant trauma as children, and then they experience combat trauma, that's even where the idea of complex PTSD came from. You're muted, Raul. Raul, you are muted.
Would you say that the big difference between two people who experience the same thing, one having more tendencies to PTSD than the other, would it be because one is more sensitive or more serious and the other one's more
It can be, but like you said, there's all kinds of factors. If you take a look at Section D, how frequent are these events? How intense are they? At what level is it involved personally? Are these, one after another being stacked? You're compounding what happened in childhood with this, your sense of responsibility, and your resilience factors. I mean, there's all those things. So there's not a simple oh, this makes the difference. There's all kinds of things that make the difference. And what we need to understand from that is trauma is trauma. It impacts everyone differently, and you need to leave people to not fitting into, authorize people to not fit into any kind of a particular box or matrix or what it's supposed to look like. That's the only way you're going to be able to help them.
So when I meet up with military people, I meet people who are from the Navy who never have face-to-face combat compared to those in the Army, the infantry. Is it right to assume that those who have face-to-face combat are actually more prone to PTSD?
Yes, because of the personal involvement. To personally witness the death of somebody else, especially if it's a result of your violence, that's a huge, huge difference. That somebody that's, lobbing rockets and missiles from 25 miles offshore.
Right.
We're thankful for the thankful for the fire support. We really are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think also what compounds what he was saying earlier. What compounds the problem is the thankless attitude of the people who they come back to, and
It can absolutely. When people were first after the first Gulf War, right? People were being lauded and celebrated, and the guys who'd been in Nam were like, "Well, good for you." No one said "welcome home" to me yet, and I've been home for 20 years. That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, huge. That is another factor.
Yeah, I noticed that because I make it a point to always thank anybody I know who I meet who's from the military.
One of the most powerful things you can say to somebody who's in Vietnam is "welcome home." You may make them cry.
Yeah, I've made a couple of people cry, really.
If you say "welcome home," if they were in Vietnam and you say "welcome home," it's very likely that they will break down in tears. So,
okay.
Any other factors you noticed that stood out to you that were different when we're dealing with combat and consequences of war so far?
Sorry, go ahead.
When they come home, all the changes that have happened, all the adjustments from being having different companions, children growing up, just a totally different life to adjust to. That's unique.
Right. So you've got you have what we call death of assumption. The assumption is everything is going to be put on hold while you're gone. Those assumptions are put to death when you get home, and they're different. Things are different. So the death of those assumptions is very powerful because it's shocking. And that loss can be significant. You can feel ripped off, you were stolen from, or you did something wrong, which is why you missed out. There's all kinds of significant emotions, negative emotions that can impact deeply. Hannah, what were you going to say?
Oh, same idea, same thing that Heather was talking about.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll tell you what, let's take 10 and we'll come back and finish this out.
The effects of deployment on the spouse and the children of a troop. You know, when a husband or a wife goes off to war, many adjustments have to be made by the home front spouse. They assume the roles of both father and mother as best they can for a while. They assume all the household chores and responsibilities of the deployed spouse. But what used to involve teamwork now has become a solo operation. There's now many emotional burdens which they can't share with the one that they are closest to on the planet. And also various temptations are more accessible during that time. Family logistics, such as trips to the doctor, shopping, or school activities or recreation are also harder to accommodate. And physical respites are also more and more rare. So as you can see, the deployed troop is not the only one who is being stressed out during the deployment. As Ranella brought up earlier, when a troop comes home, he's stressed and she's stressed, and that reintegration period can present a number of great difficulties to both the husband and the wife. They need to be very carefully negotiated. One of the most debilitating problems has to do with how returning troop, how they can affect their spouse or their children when they come home with ASD or PTSD. An increasing amount of study is being done on a condition known as secondary traumatic stress. That is the traumatizing effect of the combat troop's condition having a very negative effect on his or her spouse and children when he comes back. As a combat trauma sufferer struggles with their symptoms of PTSD, and the spouse tries to understand and adjust to this different person who has come back from the war, then many times the spouse or the children will actually begin to manifest many of the same symptoms or even different symptoms of the troop who has come back with PTSD. A spouse can also experience primary traumatic stress if the combat trauma sufferer threatens them or harms him or her. For instance, let's say a combat trauma veteran has come back and they're having a nightmare about being attacked. And he half wakes up and notices his wife in the bed next to him and thinks that she might be the enemy. And so simply as a matter of self-defense, begins to attack her. Obviously, if she feels that her life is being threatened, she could also develop PTSD or ASD.
I'm going to be talking about combat trauma and how it has impacted military women. The Pentagon says that there are more than 182,000 women who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's 11% of U.S. troops deployed. That dwarfs the 7,500 who served in Vietnam, and most of those were nurses. During our brief Gulf War, there were approximately 41,000 women who were deployed. Women are barred from ground jobs such as infantry, armor, and artillery units, and are technically confined to support roles. But those jobs include some of the most dangerous: driving convoys, being a medic, guarding checkpoints, and searching women as part of neighborhood patrols. According to Patricia Resick, who is the director of the Women's Health Science Division at the VA's National Center for PTSD in Boston, she calls the war in Iraq an equal opportunity war, with attacks not only come from enemy fighters, but also from roadside bombs or IEDs and mortars. There is no front or rear line in Iraq or Afghanistan. A person has no clear idea who or where the enemy is. There is no uniform. It could be a man, a woman, or even a child. There is no safe place. All our military men and women are in enemy territory. According to the VA, women diagnosed with PTSD accounted for 14% of the total 27,000 recent veterans treated for PTSD. For some women, combat trauma is complicated and intensified by rape or other sexual abuse, often by the comrades they trained and fought beside. Sometimes they are raped by a military superior. DA says that 20% of women seeking its care since 2003 showed signs of military sexual trauma, that's MST, compared with the 1% of the male veterans. There may be more sexual assaults, but many women hesitate to report it for various reasons, and others may be waiting until they get home. In the newspaper on January 20th, 2008, there was a cartoon of Doonesbury by Gary Tradew. The scene is a woman combat vet talking to the therapist, and she says, "Ma'am, I've been trying to think of myself as a wounded warrior, like Elias told me so, but it's been a tough sell. I keep calling myself out. I go, wait a minute, I suffered sexual assault from my country? How's that work? Like, Where's my Purple Heart? But guess what happens today? PD comes up to me today, puts this in my hand, and walks away. The therapist looks at what's in her hands and says, it's a candy heart. And the vet says, purple, of course. And the therapist reads the heart, which says, born to roll. And the vet replies, someone's got my back again, ma'am. Let's not forget the vets who are women. Let's become their battle buddies and watch their backs.
As Renella and I have been sharing the wide spectrum of reactions that our troops can have to combat trauma, we hope you've been able to appreciate how complex this subject actually is. The variety of stressors that a troop can experience when he or she is involved in combat, and the complexity of every individual that God has created is putting those two variables together. It's almost infinite. And so a one-size-fits-all approach to combat trauma is never going to very easily produce any kind of useful results. Instead, we must recognize three important points. Number one, God is the healer. Number two, you are not. And number three, nevertheless, God wants to partner with each one of us in order to construct a healing environment in which the Spirit of God can have optimal access to the body, soul, and spirit of the combat trauma sufferer in order to bring about healing. Now, how can this be accomplished? The military ministry offers two publications that anyone who is very serious about constructing that healing environment will benefit from. One is entitled The Combat Trauma Healing Manual, Christ-Centered Solutions to Combat Trauma. It was my privilege to do the research and the writing on this manual with my wife Renella's help and the help of many other people as well. And it's specifically for the returning troop who is suffering from combat trauma. It's interactive, designed to bring the troop into the Bible and understand what the Bible has to say about what he or she is experiencing. And it's designed for either a small group situation, a one-to-one situation, or even in a self-study mode, but it's best used in a small group approach. The other publication is for the wives of combat trauma sufferers, and it's entitled When War Comes Home, Christ-Centered Healing for the Wives of Combat Veterans. This was co-authored by myself and Renella, and along with Marshall Carter Waddell, who is the wife of Commander Mark Waddell, who is a Navy SEAL for 24 years and experienced 11 deployments in hot war places all over the world, and is currently struggling with PTSD. So I mentioned that a lot more needs to be said about what happens to the wives and children of combat trauma spectrum or combat trauma sufferers, and this is certainly a resource that would be helpful there. Both manuals combine the best insights of the medical and the counseling communities with the principles that are found in the most tested and verified change agent in all of history, and that is the Bible. We have plans to produce additional materials that will be addressing the specific needs of the husbands of combat trauma sufferers, their parents, and their children as well. And we'll be putting together small group study guides for these in addition. Let us conclude with Isaiah 32:2, which I think eloquently sums up what our role should be as we are involved with those who suffer from combat trauma. And that verse says that a man will be like a hiding place from the wind and a refuge from the tempest, like rivers of water in a dry place, like the shadow of a great rock in a weary land. We can't be healers, but we can be that man or that woman that provides a safe place, a refuge, a refreshment, a shelter, an enabling place that will help them to connect with their one and only true hope.
Okay, so that's the end of the video. Last thoughts, questions on what we've discussed in this last part especially? One of the things we have to remember, and we're going to talk about this next week, is the suicide rate for returning combat personnel. We're still over 20 a day. I think part of the problem is the language of PTSD. post-traumatic stress disorder. So people feel stuck. They feel like there really isn't any hope, and all they can do is learn to manage the symptoms. We know that that's not helpful. We know that it's insufficient. The challenge is, how do we make available to those who need it what they really need? Which is one of the reasons why Fallen Soldiers March Biblical Counseling Network is working to develop a curriculum that will be approved by both IABC and ACBC for a certification or commissioning for very particular biblical counseling needs. But we have to talk about this better. The goal of this, including this, is because it's a very real part of our everyday, whether we realize it or not. We are surrounded by people who are returning from deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan who are suffering and struggling silently, quietly. It's that silent scream, and nobody hears it. Last minute thoughts or questions on what we covered this evening?
Would you say that most people who come home, do they have like a feeling of regret that they ever decided to even go there? Those are not who are not.
No, I can't even think a percentage, because not that they went, but that they weren't able to win. They weren't able to bring it to a conclusion where everything was resolved. That's the deepest regret that we find from troops returning from over there.
You're talking
what's the point of going if we're not going to be able to finish it?
So even if they win the war, the fact that they weren't there in the last day is the thing, the regret.
The fact that it's not over, and it, you know, the point of fighting a war is to win the war and put an end to it. The problem is it's not ending, so it feels open-ended and undone. So the question becomes, what's the point of it anymore? Or when another things that you run into often is the rules of engagement. They can be absolutely ridiculous, and they make it impossible for combat troops to do their job and to defeat the enemy, because politicians get involved. There's a lot of anger over that. Yeah, you get because of the politics that are involved in this a lot of times. There's a whole lot of anger and animosity and frustration, and sometimes they can get turned inward on themselves. Other thoughts or questions as we come to the end of our time? Ponder this, pray about this. Do a little checking. See what you can find on the internet, even Facebook, about what's going on. You know, I mean, even if you go to, I think you can, if you go to Fallen Soldiers March on Facebook, we've got a lot of stuff posted there. There's a lot of information. You know, I have a bracelet I wear sometimes. It's called the Valhalla Project, and it says 22 a day. It's a reminder that we still have combat personnel who are dying as a result of wounds they suffered, but they're internal wounds. They're mental and emotional wounds. They're not wounds that show on the outside. but they're still dying from them because they believe lies, and they're not able to find the help that they need. And some of them won't look for it because there's a lot of shame that ends up in stigma being attached. If you're so weak that you're suffering like this or something, you deserve to suffer, which is a lot. And so military and VA have not done a good job preparing people for what we call after action. So
I like the conclusion in the film. Being the somebody to be the shelter for the guys, the gals, and then helping them being the bridge to God.
Well, and I know a lot. I know I've sat down with several Marine vets who won't talk to a vet from another branch of the service. So there's some limitations that are built in to the way they even process life. But the families then are impacted by the post-trauma distress that these combat personnel are struggling with. The family ends up traumatized. So there's a ripple effect that impacts the entire family.
I don't ask you this. I think I did. I don't remember your answer. On November 11, which is I think it's a Tuesday or a Monday, going to be honoring the veterans because it's Veterans Day, November 11, and we were thinking of having a panel for the veterans. Do you think that's a good idea?
Who's we having a panel where?
La Habra Art Gallery. We're going to have like a small audience, and we're going to be popping up questions for those civilians who don't understand what the veterans went through.
Maybe, but you gotta be real. You gotta be really selective with. You want to find people who, if they're going to do that, people who are experienced speakers, who've addressed those things before. You don't ask somebody to walk in cold who's never had to deal with that before.
So we'll have prepared questions so they can study.
Okay, but you still need somebody who's already talked about this before to walk in and not know how you're going to react. That's just mean.
Would you be interested to speak?
Probably not. I don't know. I might, but I have class that night, so.
It's in the afternoon. 2 o'clock.
Perhaps.
All right. You heard that, guys. There's a witness. Yeah, because